This is probably one of the most surreal conflicts I've ever found myself in, and honestly, I'm starting to question my own sanity. My boyfriend and I met 3 years ago, and we immediately clicked over our shared obsession with history and nonfiction. We spent our first few months together binge-watching Tudor documentaries, debating Henry VIII's succession drama, and nerding out over historical analysis. I absolutely adored that about him. I still do. And I never once expected him to share my passion for fantasy novels and epic storytelling. It's never been a deal-breaker for me that my partner doesn't love everything I love. When we picked shows to watch together, we'd go for things like true crime series, historical dramas that leaned accurate, gritty docuseries, and reality-based content we both enjoyed. We had a great rhythm going, and I thought we'd found our balance. But over the last few months, everything has shifted in a way I never saw coming. It started subtly. He'd politely pass when I asked if he wanted to watch one of our usual shows. Then came these little jabs, comments about how fiction was just a distraction, or how fantasy was for people who can't handle the real world. I let it slide at first, figuring everyone's allowed their preferences. But as you can probably tell from the title, it spiraled way beyond that. A few weeks ago, he started getting visibly irritated whenever I'd turn on one of my shows while he was home. I wasn't even asking him to watch. I was just enjoying my own thing. It was the same with my books. He actually scoffed when he caught me rereading one of my favorite fantasy novels and said, "I don't get how a grown woman can take this stuff seriously." But what happened 2 nights ago is what pushed me to write this. I'd just gotten home from work, wrapped myself in a blanket, and settled in with my book. He walked over, looked down at me, and said he can't respect someone who wastes hours on make-believe when there's real knowledge to pursue. He told me fiction is rotting my brain and that he doesn't want to be with someone who lives in stories instead of reality. I pushed back immediately, told him that was absurd. I have a stable career. I handle my responsibilities. I'm not ignoring the real world. I just happen to enjoy stories. They relax me. They're fun. They don't hurt anyone. He didn't budge. Instead, he doubled down and said if I truly cared about intellectual growth, I'd stop consuming fictional media entirely and focus exclusively on nonfiction. At first, I thought he had to be joking, but he wasn't. He said he doesn't want that garbage in his home, and that we need to be aligned on what's worth our time and mental energy. I told him flat out that was controlling and bizarre. He got defensive and said it's not control. It's just his standard for the kind of life he wants to build. I don't know what triggered this. Maybe it's burnout, maybe it's depression, maybe he fell down some weird rabbit hole online, or maybe it's something else entirely. But it's making me deeply uncomfortable, and frankly, I feel disrespected and furious. I can't even have a normal conversation with him anymore without him acting like I'm deliberately sabotaging my own intelligence by picking up a book with dragons in it. Before we begin, tell us in the comments from which city are you watching? And at the end, do not forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. It's almost cruel how the best memories can turn into evidence of what went wrong. I met him at a bookstore 3 years ago. I was in the history section scanning for something on the Wars of the Roses, and he was standing 2 feet away doing the exact same thing. We both reached for the same biography of Anne Boleyn at the exact same moment, our hands colliding awkwardly over the spine. We laughed. I made some joke about how we clearly had excellent taste, and he suggested we grab coffee to discuss who deserved the book more. That coffee turned into 4 hours of the most engaging conversation I'd had in years. We talked about Tudor politics, about Henry VIII's paranoia and desperation for a male heir, about how Catherine of Aragon got written out of her own story. He knew details I'd never heard before, and I shared theories he found fascinating. I remember thinking, This is what connection feels like. Not someone pretending to care about what I cared about. Someone who genuinely, enthusiastically did. Our first few months together were magic. We'd stay up until 2 a.m. watching documentaries about the English Reformation, pausing constantly to debate whether Anne Boleyn was a victim or a strategist, whether Thomas Cromwell deserved his reputation. We went to museums together, took a weekend trip to see a Tudor exhibit, spent entire Saturdays researching obscure historical figures just because we could. And here's the thing. Even back then, our interests diverged. I tried to get him to watch Game of Thrones with me, and he'd politely decline, saying he preferred real stories. I'd mention my favorite fantasy series, and he'd smile and say, "That's great, babe. But have you seen this new World War II documentary?" It never bothered me. I loved that he had his passions and I had mine. I thought we were modeling healthy independence. I never forced my interests on him, and he never forced his on me. Or so I thought. Looking back now, I wonder if his disinterest was actually quiet judgment all along. Was he biting his tongue those first few months? Was he cataloging every fantasy novel I read, every fictional show I watched, storing it all up as ammunition for later? Or did something genuinely change in him? I wish I knew when the man who loved history became the man who weaponized it. The first crack in our foundation was so small, I almost missed it entirely. It started about 4 months ago. I'd come home excited about a new true crime docuseries everyone was talking about. Exactly the kind of thing we used to devour together. I suggested we watch it that night, already imagining us curled up on the couch with takeout, pausing every 10 minutes to theorize about the case. He looked up from his laptop and said, "Actually, I think I'll pass tonight. You go ahead." I didn't think much of it. People get tired. People need alone time. I watched the first episode by myself and texted him updates anyway, thinking he'd get drawn in. He never asked about it again. Then it happened with the next show, and the next. Every time I'd suggest something we both used to enjoy, a historical drama, a gritty crime series, even a documentary about a real-world heist, he'd find a reason to decline. "I'm not really in the mood. I've got work to finish. I'd rather read tonight." Always polite, always reasonable sounding, but always a no. Our shared watch list, which used to be this fun, ongoing project we'd built together, started collecting dust. Shows we'd been excited about, series we'd marked to binge together. He just stopped caring. When I'd bring them up, he'd give me this distant look, like I was suggesting something trivial that wasn't worth his time. I tried to adjust. Maybe he was stressed at work. Maybe he needed more intellectual stimulation. I suggested a new historical documentary about the Roman Empire, thinking that would bridge the gap. He watched 20 minutes before saying he'd already read more. Comprehensive books on the subject, and this was surface level. That stung, but I told myself he was just being particular. I suggested a podcast about unsolved mysteries instead, something we could listen to together during dinner. He said podcasts were background noise, and he preferred to engage with material that required his full attention. It felt like he was building a wall between us, one polite refusal at a time. Every maybe later felt like not with you. Every I'd rather do something else felt like you're not enough. I kept trying to find the magic we used to have, but he kept stepping further away. And the worst part? I couldn't pinpoint exactly when our shared interests became just mine. I should have seen the warning signs when he stopped declining politely and started explaining why. It was a Saturday afternoon, maybe 3 months ago. I was scrolling through streaming options, looking for something light to unwind with after a stressful week at work. I mentioned wanting to watch this new fantasy series that had just dropped, and he didn't just say no. He sighed. That particular kind of sigh that carries judgment in every exhale. "I just don't understand the appeal," he said, not looking up from his book. It's pure escapism for people who can't deal with reality. I laughed it off, thinking he was joking. That's literally the point. It's called relaxation. He didn't laugh back. Instead, he gave me this look, like a professor disappointed in a student who wasn't living up to their potential. I guess some people need that. Some people. Not you. Not we. Some people. As if I'd suddenly been categorized into a group he'd mentally separated himself from. The comments started piling up after that. I'd mention a book I was reading, and he'd ask, "Is that fiction?" with this edge in his voice, like he was confirming a diagnosis. When I'd say yes, he'd nod slowly and say something like, "I prefer to spend my time on things that actually expand my understanding of the world." One evening we were at dinner with friends, and someone brought up a popular sci-fi show. I got excited, started talking about the plot and characters, and he cut me off mid-sentence. "It's interesting how much energy people invest in things that don't exist," he said to the table, smiling like he'd made a clever observation. "When there's so much real knowledge out there to absorb." Our friends laughed awkwardly. I felt my face flush. He started calling fiction brain candy in this condescending tone, as if enjoying a story was equivalent to rotting your teeth. He'd make comments about people who live in fantasy worlds whenever I picked up one of my novels. He'd talk about intellectual rigor and meaningful consumption like he was delivering a TED Talk I hadn't signed up for. Every jab was wrapped in the language of self-improvement and enlightenment, but what I heard was, "You're wasting your time. You're less than. You're choosing ignorance." And the worst part? I started second-guessing myself. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was escaping too much. Maybe my hobbies were childish. That's how it works, isn't it? When someone you love questions your worth often enough, you start questioning it too. The silence became more violent than any argument we'd ever had. I started noticing it about 6 weeks ago. I'd come home from work, exhausted, wanting nothing more than to decompress with a book. I'd settle onto the couch, open to my bookmarked page, and within minutes I'd feel his eyes on me. Not a loving glance, not casual awareness, a stare, the kind that makes your skin prickle with discomfort. I'd look up, and he'd be watching me with this expression I'd never seen before. Disappointment mixed with something closer to disgust. Then he'd shake his head, just slightly, barely perceptible, and turn back to whatever intellectual thing he was doing. His laptop, his non-fiction hardcover, his documentary, playing with the volume just loud enough to intrude on my space. The scoffing started shortly after. I'd pick up one of my fantasy novels, the ones I'd been reading and rereading for years, and he'd make this sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a grunt. A scoff. A noise that said, "I can't believe you're doing this again." One night I was watching one of my shows, something I'd been invested in for 3 seasons. I had my headphones on specifically so I wouldn't bother him. He walked past, glanced at the screen, and literally stopped in his tracks. "You're still watching that?" he said, not as a question, but as an accusation. "Yeah," I said, confused. "I'm almost done with the season." He shook his head and muttered something under his breath. I caught the words waste and time. I paused the show. "What did you just say?" "Nothing." But his tone said everything. It got worse. He'd sigh loudly whenever I'd reach for my books. He'd make exaggerated groaning sounds when I'd turn on the TV. He started timing me. I swear he was timing me. And making comments like, "That's 3 hours today on make-believe. Imagine if you'd spent that learning something real." I began hiding my reading. I'd wait until he went to bed, or I'd take my book to another room. I felt like a teenager sneaking contraband past a disapproving parent. In my own home, with my own partner. The tension was suffocating. Every time I wanted to relax with a story, I had to calculate whether it was worth the judgment, the scoffs, the atmosphere of contempt he'd create. I started choosing my entertainment based on his mood rather than my interests. I was being punished for joy, and I didn't know how to make it stop. The word adult became a weapon he wielded with surgical precision. I was rereading one of my favorite fantasy novels, one I'd loved for years, one that had gotten me through some genuinely difficult times. It was a Sunday morning, I had coffee, I was comfortable, and for about 20 minutes I was actually happy. Then he walked into the room, saw what I was reading, and stopped dead. "You're reading that again?" he asked, his tone dripping with something between pity and contempt. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "It's a comfort read." He picked up the book, turned it over in his hands like he was examining evidence, and read the back cover with this theatrical frown. Then he set it down and looked at me with those eyes, the ones that used to look at me with warmth, but now only held judgment. "I genuinely don't understand how an adult can take this stuff seriously," he said. I don't personally enjoy it. It's not for me." He said he didn't understand how an adult, how I, a functioning 27-year-old woman with a career and responsibilities, could take it seriously. I felt something twist in my chest. "What's that supposed to mean?" He sat down across from me, folding his hands like he was about to deliver a performance review. "I'm just saying, there comes a point where you have to put away childish things. Dragons and magic and made-up worlds, that's kid stuff. It's fine when you're young, but at some point, you need to engage with reality." "This is reality," I said, holding up the book. "Real people wrote this, real people read it, real emotions, real themes." "Dressed up in costumes and fantasy," he interrupted. "It's escapism. It's refusing to grow up." The way he said it made me feel small, ridiculous, like I was clinging to a teddy bear at 30 instead of reading a critically acclaimed novel that millions of adults enjoyed. He kept going, talked about intellectual maturity and age-appropriate interests, and how serious people focus on serious things. He made it sound like every hour I spent reading fantasy was an hour I was regressing, becoming less capable, less worthy of respect. I tried to defend myself, to explain that stories have value, that imagination isn't immaturity, that some of the greatest minds in history loved fiction. But he just smiled that patient, condescending smile. "If that's what you need to tell yourself," he said. And just like that, my favorite hobby became evidence of my failure to grow up. The night everything shattered started like any other exhausting Tuesday. I'd had a brutal day at work, back-to-back meetings, a project deadline moved up without warning, and a client who couldn't make up their mind about anything. All I wanted was to come home, wrap myself in a blanket, and disappear into my book for an hour. Just 1 hour of peace where I wasn't being demanded of, where I could exist in a world that made sense. I settled onto the couch, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and opened to where I'd left off. I was maybe 3 pages in when I heard his footsteps, felt him standing behind me, watching. "We need to talk," he said. I closed the book, dread already pooling in my stomach. "About what?" He came around the couch and stood in front of me, blocking my view of everything except him. His arms were crossed, his expression set in that way that told me this wasn't going to be a conversation, it was going to be a lecture. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "I can't sit here and watch you rot your brain with this garbage." The words hit me like a slap. "Excuse me?" "Fiction," he said, gesturing at my book like it was something toxic. "Make-believe, whatever you want to call it. It's rotting your brain, and I can't respect someone who wastes hours of their life on things that don't exist when there's real knowledge out there. Real growth. Real intellectual development." I stood up, the book falling from my lap. "Are you serious right now?" "Completely serious," he said. and his voice was cold, clinical. You're choosing to live in stories instead of reality. You're choosing ignorance over enlightenment. And I don't want to be with someone who makes those choices. My hands were shaking. I have a job. I have responsibilities. I handle everything in my life perfectly fine. Reading a book for an hour doesn't mean It means you're settling for less, he cut me off. It means you're content being mediocre. Do you know how much you could learn if you spent that time reading history, science, philosophy? Instead, you're filling your head with dragons and nonsense. This is insane, I said, my voice rising. You're treating me like I'm doing something wrong by enjoying a story. You are doing something wrong, he shot back. You're wasting your potential. And I won't enable it anymore. If you cared about intellectual growth, about us, you'd stop consuming fictional media altogether and focus on becoming someone worth respecting. The room went silent except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. This wasn't concern. This was contempt. And I was standing in my own home being told I wasn't worth respecting because I liked to read. If there's one thing I never expected from the man I loved, it was being told I was making myself stupid on purpose. The brain rot conversation should have been the bottom. I thought that was as low as we could go. Him telling me my hobbies were worthless, that I was wasting my potential, but I was wrong. Because 2 days later, he found a new way to hurt me. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop working on a report for an important client presentation. I'd been at it for hours, meticulously researching, cross-referencing data, making sure everything was airtight. My fantasy novel sat next to me. I'd planned to read a chapter as a reward once I finished, a small treat to look forward to. He walked past, glanced at the book, and stopped. "You know," he said, leaning against the counter, "every time you read that stuff, you're actively making yourself dumber." I looked up from my work, exhausted and confused. "What are you talking about?" "Your IQ," he said, as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. "Fiction doesn't challenge your brain. It doesn't build neural pathways or enhance cognitive function. If anything, it does the opposite. You're choosing to lower your intelligence every single time you pick that up." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. "I'm serious," he continued. "Studies show that people who consume too much fiction have decreased critical thinking skills. You're literally choosing to be less intelligent. And I don't understand why anyone would intentionally do that to themselves." The implication was clear. I was sabotaging my own mind, deliberately, willfully making myself less capable, less smart, less worthy. Every time I opened a book I loved, I was apparently committing intellectual suicide. "That's not how brains work," I said, my voice shaking. "That's not how any of this works." He shrugged. "Believe what you want." "But I can't be with someone who's intentionally lowering their IQ. I need a partner who values growth, who challenges themselves intellectually, not someone who's content getting dumber by the day." I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. This man, the man who claimed to love me, had just told me I was choosing stupidity, that my favorite thing in the world was evidence of my intellectual decline. And the worst part? For a split second, I actually wondered if he might be right. That's what emotional abuse does. It makes you doubt your own mind. There's a difference between criticism and control, and I learned it the night he brought out the box. It was Thursday evening. I'd just gotten home, exhausted from another long day, and found him sitting in the living room with a cardboard box at his feet. Not just any box. One he'd clearly prepared with "banned" written across the side in thick black marker. "What is that?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "Sit down," he said. Not a request. A command. I stayed standing. "What's going on?" He stood up, positioned himself between me and the hallway, and crossed his arms. "I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've made a decision. I don't want fictional media in my home anymore. No books, no shows, no movies, none of it. It's done. My home. Not our home. My home. You can't be serious, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm completely serious, he said, his tone businesslike, as if he were announcing a new household policy about taking out the trash. This is my space, and I get to decide what kind of environment I live in. I've tried to be patient. I've tried to help you see reason, but you keep choosing this garbage over real growth, and I'm done watching it happen under my roof. This is my home too, I said, finding my voice. You don't get to dictate what I read or watch. That's not how relationships work. He picked up the box and held it out to me. Then we need to be on the same wavelength about what's worthy of our time and energy. If you want to be with me, if you want to build a life with me, you need to commit to intellectual growth, real growth, not this escapist nonsense. I looked at the box, looked at him, looked at the man I thought I knew, the man who used to respect me, and saw only a stranger. This is controlling, I said. This is bizarre and controlling, and I won't do it. His jaw tightened. It's not controlling. It's a standard. It's the kind of life I want to build, and I need a partner who wants the same thing. If you can't respect that, if you can't respect me, then maybe we need to reconsider this entire relationship. There it was. The ultimatum. My books and shows, or him. My joy or his approval. My autonomy or his love. And standing there staring at that box with banned written across it, I finally understood. This was never about intellectual growth. This was about control. Sometimes the truth arrives not as a gradual understanding, but as a sudden, devastating clarity. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the guest room, the room I'd retreated to because I couldn't stand being near him, and I replayed every conversation, every scoff, every condescending comment. I thought about the man I'd fallen in love with and the stranger who now stood in his place, and somewhere around 3 a.m., staring at the box with banned scrawled across it, everything clicked into focus. This was never about intellectualism. It was never about growth or knowledge or becoming better versions of ourselves. If it had been, he would have celebrated my curiosity, not crushed it. He would have understood that stories teach empathy, that fiction explores the human condition in ways nonfiction sometimes can't. That imagination isn't the enemy of intelligence. It's a fundamental part of it. Real intellectual growth involves questioning, exploring, and yes, imagining. It involves understanding that people process the world differently, that there's value in diverse perspectives, that respecting your partner's autonomy is more important than curating their mind. True intelligence includes emotional intelligence, the ability to see another person as a whole human being, not a project to be corrected. What he was doing wasn't education. It wasn't enlightenment. It was control dressed up in the language of self-improvement. He was systematically dismantling my confidence, making me doubt my own judgment, isolating me from the things that brought me joy. And he was doing it all while claiming it was for my own good, that he knew better, that his standards were simply higher than mine. I thought about the phrase, his home, about how he'd positioned himself as the authority figure, and me as the child who needed discipline, about how he'd weaponized intellectualism to create a hierarchy where he stood above me, superior and certain, while I groveled below, apologizing for daring to enjoy things he deemed unworthy. This wasn't about books. This was about power, about a man who needed to feel intellectually dominant and had found the perfect excuse to make me feel small. Every brain-rot comment, every IQ insult, every scoff, they were all tools designed to break down my sense of self until I believed I needed him to tell me how to think, what to read, who to be. But here's what he didn't understand. A partner who truly respects you doesn't demand you abandon the things that make you who you are. And I deserved better than someone who confused control with care. The hardest lessons are the ones that cost us the most to learn. Here's what I wish I'd understood sooner. Intellectualism should bring people together, not tear them apart. A partner who truly values growth celebrates your curiosity in all its forms, not just the forms they approve of. When someone tries to curate your mind, police your joy, or ban what makes you human under the guise of standards, they're not offering growth. They're demanding submission. Real intellectual development includes the emotional intelligence to respect autonomy, to honor differences, to understand that love means supporting who someone is, not reshaping them into who you think they should be. Control wearing the mask of concern is still control, and you deserve someone who sees your imagination as a strength, not a flaw to be corrected. If this story resonated with you, remember, you don't need permission to enjoy what brings you joy. You don't need to justify your passions to anyone, and you never need to shrink yourself to fit someone else's narrow definition of worth. Real strength is recognizing when respect has turned into control, and having the courage to choose yourself. Thank you for watching to the end. If today's story touched you even a little, please hit subscribe so you won't miss new stories every week. Which moment hit you hardest? Tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video so the algorithm knows you want more stories about finding your voice and reclaiming your power. If you're watching from a particular city, share where you're tuning in from. I'd love to see how wide our community reaches. See you in the next one.